Howdy, and welcome to Wise About Texas, the Texas History Podcast. This is your host, Ken Wise. Thank you very much for tuning in today for a little bit of Texas history. Today, we're going to talk about a woman of the Old West who was not born in Texas, and she didn't die in Texas, but she made quite the name for herself in Texas. And the story revolves around professional gambling. So if you've got the little ones with you, this may not be the episode for them. But this was a very interesting lady, and we're going to go back to the middle 19th century and get wise about Texas. The subject of our episode today had a nickname. Her nickname was Lottie Deno. She was born Charlotte Tompkins in Warsaw, Kentucky, April 21st, San Jacinto Day, 1844. Her father, Thomas B. Tompkins, was a very successful planter. He was also a member of the Kentucky Association, which was formed in 1826. It included the elite of Kentucky, including Henry Clay. And the Kentucky Association opened a racetrack. Now, the racetrack eventually shut down in the 30s, but it was one of the first big thoroughbred racetracks in Kentucky. And supposedly, it was opened on a portion of Henry Clay's estate, which was called Ashland. There is still an Ashland Stakes run in Kentucky every year. Some of the other big Kentucky races, including the Bluegrass Stakes, originated at the Kentucky Association track. In any event, Mr. Tompkins was a member. He was said to have owned a fantastic string of thoroughbred racehorses. He was also said to be an expert card player. So that's the environment where his daughter Charlotte, sometimes referred to as Carlotta, grew up. Now, Lottie is a nickname for Charlotte. So that's how she came to be known as Lottie. Supposedly, growing up, her father had taught her to play cards, and she had become a fairly expert card handler at a very young age. She was also highly educated. They sent her to a convent for her education, which was a common thing in the 1800s. But then the Civil War came along, and after the war, the area of Kentucky, her father had enlisted in the Confederate Army, so they eventually lost everything that they had. Her father passed away, and the responsibility for taking care of her ailing mother and her little sister fell to Lottie. So she went to Detroit, Michigan, either on her own or was sent there by her family. There are some accounts that say she had relatives up there. In any event, she goes to Detroit and becomes kind of a favorite on the social scene, but the money was running out. As the Civil War ended, her father had already died and her mother was dying, but she still had a sister to take care of, so she decided to head west. She goes to New Orleans, where she does the thing that she knows how to do the best, which is gamble. Now, gambling, you got to understand, in the 1800s was extremely prolific. There weren't the laws that we have today regulating it in any form or fashion, and you could find just about any game you wanted just about anywhere. And so she gambled in New Orleans a little bit and then kept moving west, eventually ending up in San Antonio in 1865. Now, during that whole time period that I just described up in Detroit, she met a guy named Johnny Golden, who was also a gambler. And they were alleged to be romantically involved. And there's all kinds of stories about promises they made to each other, et cetera, none of which I could independently substantiate. So she may have followed Johnny Golden to San Antonio, maybe not. But in any event, she ends up in San Antonio in 1865. Well, one of the gambling houses in San Antonio at that time was called the University Club. And I just want to mention something on the side here. If any of my San Antonio listeners have any information on the University Club in Old San Antonio, I'd love to see it, because it's been very difficult to find any information on that club. But one of the owners of the University Club was named Frank Thurman. So Lottie meets Frank, and she becomes one of the house gamblers for the University Club, because the card games at these places, and I'm sure it's still this way in places, the casinos would employ people to play in these games. And Lottie was called a house gambler. Now, one of the poorly kept secrets about these professional gamblers is they almost always cheated, and they would have their certain tricks that they used. And Lottie was no different. She, when she is described as an expert card handler, that means that she had some tricks up her sleeve. Everybody sort of knew that about these professional gamblers, but they still thought they could beat them. And if that sounds familiar, that system more or less is probably still in place today. Everybody thinks they can beat the house, but if you play long enough, you're going to lose. Now, we need to explain her last name at this point, because it was during a series of games where she had won a tremendous amount of money that somebody said, hey, you ought to call yourself Lottie Deno instead of Lottie. And that's she decided to adopt that nickname, sort of, and call herself Lottie Deno as a way to kind of cover her identity and protect herself even more. So that's when she kind of began using the name Lottie Deno, and she had a distinct advantage over the other card players. She was a woman, so you can imagine in 1865 San Antonio, people would much rather play with a pretty lady than a bunch of stinking cowboys. So she was very popular, even though she skinned just about everybody that sat down with her. You also have to remember that she was a highly educated lady from the very upper crust of Kentucky society. She dressed very well in lovely clothes. She had very genteel manners, according to all the first-hand accounts, and was generally a very quiet, pleasant person. And so she got another nickname while she was at the University Club. They called her the Angel of San Antonio, because apparently she was very polite as she took all of your money. Well, she and Frank Thurman eventually fell for each other. Now, there are stories out there, but I don't give him a lot of credit that it was Thurman's son that she fell in love with. I think it was Frank Thurman, the owner. Now, Frank was a pretty tough guy in his own right, as you might expect. He ended up in San Antonio. He was playing a game and got into a fight with one of the other men in the game, and Frank Thurman kept a Bowie knife on a string and down his back inside the coat. So all he had to do is reach in, grab the string, and he had a knife in his hand, which he did when he got into this fight, and ended the fight and ended the life of his opponent. Well, I guess the family thought he would get off on self-defense, because the family of the dead man put a bounty on Frank Thurman, and he decided to leave town with a promise from Lottie that she'd come find him. So she did that. She left San Antonio and the University Club, and she started going to the various places in Texas where she thought she could make a pretty good living gambling. She went to Fort Concho. She went to Denison. She went to Fort Worth. She went to Jacksboro. Eventually, she runs into Frank at a place called Fort Griffin, where she got a job there dealing cards. Now, we need to say a few words about Fort Griffin, although I plan on giving it its own episode one day, because this was a very interesting place. The fort was built up on a hill, and about 500 yards east of the fort, as the land sloped down toward the Clear Fork of the Brazos, a town sprung up. Now, it wasn't unusual for towns to spring up near these forts. This town was called, well, they would call it the town of Fort Griffin, but it was colloquially known as the Flat, or the Flats. The Flat was a place where no one asked where you were from. In fact, you could get in trouble asking too many questions. It is said the law officers in the Flat were themselves outlaws at one time or another. Everybody carried a gun. There were plenty of gambling halls, plenty of saloons. There is a story that Wyatt Earp operated a game in Fort Griffin at one time. There was a 1908 book written called Shackelford County Sketches. It was written by Don Biggers, again, 1908. This is what Mr. Biggers wrote about Fort Griffin. Quote, "To illustrate the strenuous story of the West, the conditions of early days, and portray the character of the pioneer population, no more appropriate subject than Fort Griffin could possibly be selected. It embodies the good and the bad, the best and the worst, generosity and extravagance, friendship, treachery and crime, cowardice and courage, baseness and honor, humor, pathos, and philosophy. Every element in the character of men and every kind of conduct incident to unlicensed freedom played its part here." Close quote. I thought that was a very interesting way to capture the fact that Fort Griffin had a little bit of everything. The reason is its location. It's north of Albany in Shackelford County, and that was a central location for many purposes necessary to the time, one of which was the Indian Wars, still in full swing. Ranald Mackenzie was headquartered at Fort Griffin at one time. So you had the military operations, and then you had the comings and goings of people who needed to get out of town and head west where they wouldn't be found. And so you had that aspect. You had people who were on their way further west and needed to stop over. So you had that aspect. The other big thing that happened was the buffalo hunting, commercial buffalo hunting, started getting serious during this time period, and eventually enough buffalo were killed in the northern herd that the buffalo hunters came south and started killing the buffalo in the southern herd, which meant Texas. So Fort Griffin and the Flat became a headquarters for the southern buffalo trade. So you had all kinds of different people mixing in this town, and I can't help but think of the HBO show Deadwood. That's probably a lot of what this was like. The political structure was different, of course, but it was just a rough place to live. Therefore, a lot of people who were very involved in the popular activities of the town didn't live very long. So this is the town that Lottie Deno walked into and started dealing cards at a place called the Beehive. One of the people Lottie met at the Beehive was John Henry Holliday. You know him probably better by his nickname, Doc Holliday. He had been a dentist in Dallas and was at this point gambling in Fort Griffin. One day, there was one game when Lottie was dealing a game called Faro, and Doc Holliday lost $3,000 to her in one game. Another story goes that Doc and Lottie were in the middle of a Faro game when Doc's girlfriend came up. Now, Doc's girlfriend was named Kate Elder, and they called her Big Nose Kate. And Big Nose Kate came up, got a little jealous, and she got into it with Lottie. There is an author who purports to have the actual words that Lottie said to Big Nose Kate. I'm not going to repeat them on this podcast, but both women pulled guns, and apparently Doc Holliday jumped in the middle and avoided any shooting. Another interesting thing that happened in Fort Griffin was that Johnny Golden showed up, and Lottie informed him that it had been too long. She was in love with Frank Thurman and not interested in Johnny anymore. Coincidentally, the next day, Johnny Golden ends up dead, shot in the back behind the Beehive Saloon. Lottie actually paid for a new suit for him to be buried in, paid his funeral costs, but did not go to the funeral. My favorite story to come out of this time was that Lottie was dealing Faro, and there were two gamblers that got in a fight. Now, when you read the account of this story, the gamblers are referred to as Monty Bill and Smokey Joe. So I'm already a little suspect of whether this is totally accurate, but the story does appear in several firsthand accounts of people who were there, or some version of the story. So something like this happened for sure. These two individuals accuse each other of cheating. They probably were cheating. And one of my favorite lines from one of the accounts is, each of the gamblers thought he could beat the other to the draw, but each was only half right. They both ended up dead in the shooting. They shoot each other over the table, and both of them are dead. Everybody around, of course, fled the scene immediately except for one person, and that was Lottie Deno, who stayed at the table as if nothing was happening. The sheriff mentioned that he's not sure, he doesn't understand why she just sat there. And her quote supposedly is, "Because, Sheriff, you have never been a desperate woman." Don't know if that's true or not, but it's a great story. The other part of that story is all the money on the table ended up in Lottie Deno's purse. So you might know why she remained. Well, Lottie and Frank Thurman eventually leave Fort Griffin and move to New Mexico. They moved to Silver City. They got married, and they were still gambling. Frank got into another fight, used the same Bowie knife, presumably pulled from on the same string, and killed another man. It was self-defense. He wasn't charged, but apparently that got them convinced to get out of the gambling business. So they did, and they moved to Deming, New Mexico. Frank got involved in the real estate business. He also got involved in mining, and he started to make some pretty good money. He ended up being a vice president of the Deming National Bank. Lottie quit going by Lottie Deno and returned to her original name of Charlotte, of now Thurmond. And Charlotte Thurmond was a well-respected member of the community. She was not a professional gambler anymore. She was involved in all the societies. I think there was a society in Deming called the Ladies Gossip Society, which is awesome. And she was involved in that and quite the pillar of the community. However, there is a story that in 1892, she had joined the Episcopal Church, and they needed some money to build a new church. And the word is that Lottie, or Charlotte, Miss Thurman, donated $40,000 that she had won in a poker game with Doc Holliday to finance the church. Well, Holliday had been dead a while in 1892, so who knows if that's true, but it's like one of those stories that if it isn't true, it ought to be. So what is true is she donated $40,000. But she had gone from making poker hands to making altar cloths. Frank and Charlotte lived together in Deming for over 40 years. Frank passed away in 1908, but Lottie did not pass away until 1934, and they are both buried in Deming, New Mexico. It is said that the character of Miss Kitty on Gunsmoke was modeled after Lottie Deno. So Lottie Deno was a tough woman in tough circumstances in a tough time, but a very interesting character of the Old West who made quite the name for herself in Texas. Well, now we come to the portion of the episode I call Getting There, where I can tell you how to see some of the places I mentioned in the episode. The Fort Griffin State Historic Site is about 15 miles north of Albany, Texas, on Highway 283. All of these Texas fort sites are very interesting to visit, and they've done a great job up there at Fort Griffin. Been a little while since I've been up there. I hope to hear from some of my friends up there. So check out Fort Griffin if you're in the Albany area. That would be where Lottie spent a significant amount of time and really built her reputation. If you're southwest of there, Fort Concho was located where San Angelo is now. So if you're in that area, you can see Fort Concho, where Lottie spent some time. She spent some time in Jacksboro going east. Fort Richardson was in Jacksboro, and it's there's a historic site there as well. Now, Lottie spent some time in New Orleans. That speaks for itself. Silver City, New Mexico is in southwestern New Mexico. If you're in El Paso, it's about 150 miles. You go I-10, and then you turn north on State Highway 180, and that'll take you to Silver City. And what's interesting about Silver City, and not only did Lottie and Frank live there and gamble there, but so did Billy the Kid. So did Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch. In fact, the sheriff of the county where Silver City is located is considered the first person to have arrested Billy the Kid, arresting him for theft. So that would be an interesting stop if you're in that area. Deming, New Mexico, where Lotto and Frank lived most of their marriage and where they're buried, is only about 100 miles from El Paso on I-10, so a little bit easier trip. And Lottie and Frank rest in the Mountain View Cemetery in Deming. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Wise About Texas. Thanks for listening today. Find us on Twitter and Instagram at Wise About Texas. Like and share the Wise About Texas Facebook page. And if you'd like to support the preservation and promotion of Texas history, go to patreon.com/wiseabouttexas. That'll do it. Go out and do something for Texas today. And until next time, God bless Texas, and we'll see you down the road.